film has become one of the main places that people can innovate in music and think about music in creative new ways. The pairing of the image and sound is so powerful. And so just to kick off, I'd like to open up a little discussion about how is that changing and how has technology changed that? Like maybe Mike, when I visited you and we went, you showed me around kind of some of the really old studios and the way, like talked about the way that music was made for films, like 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and then today. Like what are the biggest changes that you've seen?
I think there was a standard up until not that long ago where to score a movie you wrote on something that ended up on paper, or you wrote with pencil and paper, or you wrote in a machine that spit out a chart. And the palette that you were painting with, so to speak, was an orchestra, and that it took a standard traditional orchestral format to score a film, and that was pretty much the standard across most genres of film, and to make it sound cinematic. And to some extent, maybe some of that still rings true today as a component of a score. But it wasn't that long ago. I mean, starting maybe with things like Johnny Greenwood doing "There Will Be Blood," around that time, a decade and a half ago. That scores became, sounds became cinematic that weren't necessarily just orchestral. And there are certainly people, Marius being a fantastic example of someone that's been using digital production tools. I mean, Hans Zimmer's kind of one of the godfathers of modern film scoring, using samplers and sequencers and all of that. But, the fact that you can now score a movie with a guitar or a non-conventional instrument, it's I think anything's game. It's a much broader definition of what it takes to make movie score cinematic without necessarily going into a room with 80 to 100 players and firing up a traditional orchestra. You can go back decades to the likes of Jerry Goldsmith scoring Planet of the Apes, doing modern music at that time, which is how it was described, but modern then was still using an orchestra in different ways and banging on mixing bowls and doing things, but it was still within a couple of degrees of a pretty standard palette. And so I think now it's feasible that anything from an orchestra to a ROLI block could conceivably generate film score. I think.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
Okay, so we got a good answer on question one. Keep moving. Has the function of music in film changed as well? Because sometimes you go back and you listen to some of the early scores, and there's a way in which you feel the orchestra is being leveraged to support and generate emotion. And there's a certain kind of, there's even the kind of Bugs Bunny type music, which is amazing, and there's some really good music there, but it's, there's examples where it feels like, it's not manipulative, but it's very much, playing a supporting role to a certain kind of emotion in film. And has the advent of these new tools and technologies changed that at all? Like, does music sometimes function differently in other films? What do you guys think?
I mean, it's tough for me to talk about the entire history of film music in that way. But I think that the function of music is always to tell the story. And the way that you do that depends greatly upon genre. So in animation, you tend to have to, score all of the beats, help tell the story, because it's not there in people's facial expressions, and there's less you can kind of leave to the brain making it up in their own imagination. So I think that the function of score in animation is quite different from the function in score in live action, which is also different if it's an action film, if it's a subtle drama, if it's a psychological thriller, if it's a horror film. Those all have different functions. My guess is that the function of music hasn't changed much through technology. I think that that's part of storytelling in general.
Yeah, it's you said manipulative, and I think people, both on the creative side and on the audience side, are becoming more sensitive to that and more willing to play with an absence of that. I think it's more common now to see some movies with almost no music in at all. I mean, the very appropriately called Silence recently has, I think, no score, or maybe one chord. in a 3-hour film, and it plays very well without it. And to speak to what Mike was talking about, really in the last 2 or 3 years, I've sensed an appetite for a kind of music that's not engaged with the narrative, except in a very slow, atmospheric way. And I think Stephen Price's Gravity was a good example of that coming through. So where there is music, and silence is obviously a strange example, it still obviously has something to do with the emotional component of the experience. It fills in that part of the colouring process, but often in a much subtler, slower, more accumulative way.
Please.
I just want to say that I think the sound design also, there's a great deal more sound design in films and TV than there used to be, and sometimes, having been at many of the mixes of my own music, there's a real battle between who wins sound design or score, and the sound design is now often acting as score. So I think there is a fundamental sort of aesthetic that's changed, because if you think back to Planet of the Apes, for example, there was not a great deal of sound effects in that movie, and the score was acting as everything. Now if you have even a TV show, the sound effects are like this deep, every footstep. And I actually heard a mixer, and I thought this was insane, say that their orientation towards sound effects versus music is to have the music at half the volume of sound effects.
When you say sound design is score, do you mean like sound effects, or do you mean the actual? Because the one way, when you first said that, I was thinking a little bit of a comment that people made about his work a couple of years ago. They're like, yeah, he's doing a lot of great stuff with one note, and that to me is the kind of sound design as score, like, because there's so much design within that one note, and sound and sonic, like timbral changes. Is that what you're talking about?
I think that's where they bridge. That's where they kind of morph, and it becomes hard to tell what's what exactly. And absolutely, this sort of atmospheric beds that create this feeling without actually having to assemble a bunch of notes in a very specific pattern. I think the ways of scoring are very effective, and I'd say for myself, the thing that I keep getting asked for is to do anything other than what's been done before, which is always kind of it's a very challenging directive, considering if you spend all this time training to become an orchestral composer. But that is probably the most common request, and I've even had people ask for less music-y music. So I think all those things are changes in aesthetic, in my opinion.
I think what I'd add to that, just from my experience, is because of technology, back to your original question, has the palette changed? I think the ability to iterate much quicker now is given directors or people that we work with, like, oh, can you try that as well? Like, the ability to try things much quicker and have something to show them has, been from a week to basically, okay, give me an hour or 10 minutes and you'll hear something else. And if that works. So the collaboration actually, in my experience, seems better in that way, because you're getting more iteration, more time with your director, and that can work both ways, good or bad.
Do you intentionally slow down your process a little bit so that you don't? Because I do.
Yeah.
I absolutely do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, I mean, there's so many interesting things that we're touching on. I think one of them is that, to your point about like one note being a cue in a movie, if you're making a record, one note for 3 minutes may not be your most inspired work, but it might be a genius choice as a film composer. So when someone plays you a piece of music and says, listen to this, it sounds like film score, I don't know what that means necessarily without seeing the picture, because it could, as a piece of music that might be very busy and dynamic, it could be a good piece of film music depending on what's up on the screen, or conversely, someone making a bold choice to say, here's a whole note for the entirety of this sequence. There's a whole just component as a composer, as a music maker, when you get into the realm of visual media, where storytelling is key. And so there's people who have made genius records who may or may not be fantastic film composers, and vice versa, because certain kinds of, like there are types of electronic music that could be very linear and repetitive, which could be very cool music functionally if you're at a rave, or if you're putting headphones on and getting lost in that piece of music. But in a film, you know, it may or may not serve the picture as the filmmaker needs it to. So the cool thing these days, to your original point as well, is that the likes of Daft Punk or M83 or the Chemical Brothers are people who are known for, you know, making music as electronic artists. The fact that they are scoring movies and that they have, you know, that they have kind of created a way to sort of take music that sounds like the kind of records they've made, but also have it function as film score, is a pretty kind of cool evolution for those particular artists and for that kind of music. You know, conversely, there's people who've had great success making records the way that they make records, and then all of a sudden they find themselves as composers in a situation where someone's telling them what to do, or someone's telling them what's good or what's not good. Generally, most of the conversation, as these guys can tell you, is if people are talking to you a lot about your music, it probably means it's not good. The good ones just get checked off the list and you move on to the next thing. But if there's a lot of conversation, whether it's about the relative balance between your music and other elements, or this piece of music just being evaluated against picture, if people are talking about it a lot, you're probably getting smaller and smaller in your chair, or trying to find a way to be thick-skinned about it as an artist, because generally everyone is going to tell you what's not right about it. So it's a whole other skill set, I think, in addition to being able to be a good music maker, to then kind of be part of a collaborative who are putting something up on the screen where your music is a component of that whole.
What I say is you have to love it and invest yourself in it as much as you possibly can, knowing that it may be tossed in the trash can.
So I want to come back to the question of timing in a minute, but just like, I'm really curious about the dynamics and some of the process of filmmaking and of scoring, and the role of the composer and the director, and how that, and the reason is to do with, there's certain films where music is complementary, where it's like emotion A, the music does that work, it all kind of works together. But in other cases, the music can fight a little bit with the story, or it can push it in another direction, or it can add a layer of meaning that changes the meaning of the film. Like, one example I would say would be Interstellar. Interstellar has very strong religious overtones. And yes, it's in the film, but it's even more in the music. It's all those organs, you know, that really gives it this kind of the hermeneutic of the whole film. Then it's like you read it in a different way because of that sound and because of the organs and the associations of, you know, the religious and the divine. It pushes it. And so I'm just curious, like, you know, how much does that come often in your experience from a directorial vision, and how much sometimes can composers actually define the meaning of a film through the music and through the way that they write the music?
Well, I think Mike drew attention to occasionally Hans being credited for being the master of the one note thing, but also he's the master of the big idea. And for sure, the tonality of the organ driving Interstellar was it would have been him, you know, making an expansive gesture very close to the beginning of the process and saying, I know we will use an organ. And that actually being a really great idea and a defining idea for the movie, and for, as you rightly say, the meaning of the movie eventually. And I think directors look to composers not just to support and complement what they're doing, but ideally to bring something to it that raises the game of the storytelling and the communication of the film. And that is also an example of a film where the relative balance between music and effects and music and dialogue is unusually in favor of music, for what it's worth.
Are there other examples either that you guys have worked on or others have kind of that have that character where the music brings this like genuinely other dimension or character?
I was going to say, I think every director and every producer is looking for that. If they can, they often do not have a concrete idea of what they want, but what they want is something they've never heard before that is perfect for their project. And it's a very amorphous idea, and consequently, I think we're all often functioning in areas where we've never been before. And that's why each new project is fairly uncomfortable. I mean, my wife can attest that every time I go a little bit crazy for the first month or so. And yeah, it's they want something they haven't heard before. They might have an idea of it, but they don't know exactly what it is. That's been my experience.
And I think coming up with something novel and deep, an idea like the organ being drawn to breath and religion and all that, the composer, probably everyone on the film, but specifically composers, need to find the collaborators that will allow them that freedom to think that way and the time to experiment, to do those things. I mean, I think that's certainly a dream of mine, but to find people that will allow you to have artistic ideas and to follow through with them. And that's not every project, and that's not every collaboration, and not every project or collaboration calls for that necessarily either. But I think that's the perfect ideal.
Yeah, just very quickly, a bit more on what everyone's already saying, but a lot of it is the game and figuring out what works for the director and helping them tell their story that isn't said in words or in what you're seeing visually. So you have a lot of power with undertones. How are the characters feeling, even though if they're smiling, you've got sad music, you're internalizing what the character is feeling and storytelling in that way. But I think a big part of it is working with your director and figuring out what works. And it is uncomfortable when you get it wrong initially, but then dialing it in and navigating that is pretty rewarding at the end of it. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fair for every filmmaker making a film to strive to be unique, right? And music's often a big part of that. And there's also trends in music. And if you're making a comedy today, and you decide to have a composer score it with an orchestra and pizzicato strings and trombones and kazoos and all of that, it might sound kind of vanilla or dated or just not particularly cool. And someone a few years ago decided, comedies all sound a bit raunchier and cooler if we use kind of retro rock combos with a hint of strings to make it, fill the screen but feel kind of like, record and groove driven. The same way if you're scoring a drama, decades ago, you might have had more real estate as a composer to have longer tunes, just more bars to be melodic, and to have an A section, a B section, even a hook, and and now it's sort of your tunes are pretty compressed into maybe a couple of notes or barely a bar, and you have more kind of motifs and riffs and less fully developed melodies and structures and sections and things. But that's not to say that things won't come. It's all cyclical, and that trends won't take us back around. Maybe thanks to La La Land, things will start sounding a little bit more like kind of a throwback to a more classic, sophisticated era of maybe Michel Legrand style scores are going to come back in fashion, and it'll be less of nothing against Hans, but less of a whole note. Hans is a genius, and the reason that he's so sought after and has had such successful collaborations is he's the music guy, but he's a fellow filmmaker to Jim Brooks and Chris Nolan and these directors that have always had him around. Hans is a pretty smart storyteller and co-filmmaker, and sometimes maybe too honest about someone might be looking to him to fix something with music, and then he might turn around and say, well, here's what's broken about your film, and I'll do what I can, but you fix your film and I'll help with the music. And takes some insight and some skill and everything, but I don't even remember what I was talking about. I'm just rambling.
No, it all makes sense, and I have to concur, especially on the thanks to La La Land, on several levels, because amazing film, and also amazing for us basically to see just the kind of starting out this story, like me making Seaboard, making these products, and it's not being in the film as much as just being used in, and hearing it in pieces of music and having that come back. Like I remember early on when I got started, with the Seaboards and all the stuff we're doing here, people said like, what's the measure of success? And for me, it was like seeing it come back in the world, like in performances, in pieces of music, in films, hearing it and feeling like that tool has somehow impacted the process. And one particular thing, you brought up, Kevin, that I was interested in was like the timing. How do the tools affect the timing of creativity? Because it seems like, again, a long time ago, it took you'd write it down and then you'd perform it, and now the cycles have changed. And that's something I've been interested in with the Seaboard in particular, towards, are there things that we can do that become more, maybe Marius, you could speak to this as well, like real time, like where you can be actually looking at an image and playing with something, because some of the tools that we have that are very powerful electronically still involve a bit of post. And we've been interested in this idea of real time, like of touch, that you can touch something and feel it moving as you're watching and relating to the image.
One of the reasons I was attracted to the Seaboard way back from the first time I saw it, which was not even at NAMM, it was at South by 4 years ago now. You know,
that was the first
prototype.
It was the first time it was ever shown in the public.
Even black.
Wow, yeah.
And I kind of had this must-have feeling about it then, and I got one. You know, you kindly provided me one fairly early on after you started, you know, manufacturing them properly, and it became just a very welcome presence in the studio because it's so tactile and immediate, and but to speak to the wider part of your question, it's yes, of course. I mean, it's good to be watching image and to be able to respond in all of those different dimensions in real time. But at some point, because of the nature of cinema, that has to be fixed. And the later in the process that you have a lot of elements where you're still pushing things around in several dimensions, the more fraught the process of finally locking this into some sort of shape is. And so the sort of adaptability of the process that you're referring to actually becomes a hazard late in the process, because you end up with too many cumulative decisions and not enough time to make them in. And back in the days that Mike was referring to, when pencil, paper, score, there's the music, a little bit of editorial to the extent that it was possible, you know, the variables were really quite small then, and for a while it was clearly exciting that the variables became greater and that you could do more. And then there's a tipping point where that actually flips back on itself and becomes unwelcome, because there is no possibility of focus when there is an infinite amount of choice. You see?
No, I mean, I think it's it's something we think about, and in fact, that is something we're thinking a lot about now with the Blocks product, because with all the modularity, there's all these different possibilities of how you can set it up, but there's a potential that as an instrument, there's no focus. You know what I mean? It's just kind of like all over the place. And so we're trying to think like about how we design the software in a way that does focus it down to solve certain problems, and to kind of extend the palette by also knowing how to tactically limit it. And it's a difficult thing with palettes, because at some point you have to paint, and you need to have, you know, an option like that you can reach those colors that you want, rather than just having an infinite store of colors and then you're stuck with the colors and you're not actually on the canvas. And I think it's a really subtle balance in music to have those right tools and the tools with the right form that speak to you. So, you know, it's something that, you know, that we're working on, and film composition, because it's so innovative, and there's this really interesting storytelling context, is a great one for us to kind of learn from and experiment with.
I'll jump in on this one. The product you have in terms of expressivity and all of that is phenomenal. I mean, I work with Rahman, who's adopted the Seaboard right from the beginning, and just to kind of touch on the infinite possibilities. You know, the presets help a lot, and we spend a lot of time. We give ourselves that palette where we choose, okay, these are the 5 sounds, and then he goes and starts, you know, he does his genius playing melodies, and it's all free form. So we kind of thought it'd be interesting, because we do it a little bit backwards. We let him do his creativity, the stuff that comes to him, and how he's inspired because of the tactile feel and the touch and the way how it's so expressive. And then once we have it, that's kind of our locked palette. We work backwards and then find places in the film for it to work. And I know that's, you know, very often the reverse, but it's worked wonderfully on many projects that we've done, and you just get that moment that he's done and it's inspired by, and it works. So.
You know what's cool about all of this too? We talk about infinite choice and innovation. Is, you know, if someone composes music for a conventional instrument and puts it on paper or plays it on a score or even on a record, generally hopefully someone who's really skilled at that instrument could pick it up and read that chart and play that part. Whereas if you're using a C-board or a block or, you know, something in a very kind of personalized and innovative way, you could give that tool to another person and they could be really hard pressed to recreate what you've done. So the ability to be unique and innovative and have it be personalized, and, you know, not that the point of making music should be that nobody else can create it, but you're a lot closer to being in that realm with the instruments that you're making than, you know, if you play something on a piano and say, well, I can prepare the piano, there's things that I can do with it, but you're painted into a little bit more of a box that, you know, that there's only, you know, that thing about there's only 12 notes, or, you know, 11 or 12 depending on how much you want to argue about it, you know, keys, but, you know, you've got the space between the keys, you know, and all kinds of other, you know, depth and control and, you know, sort of realms you can dip in and out of with these tools that you don't necessarily have with other instruments. And what's cool about film music specifically is there's a lot you can do electronically. The reason that orchestras are still around making movie music is there is something about human expression and the kind of the chemistry that you get by putting an orchestra in a room that, you know, it's not that it can't be done electronically or recreated by a computer. It just might take a lot longer and might be more laborious. But you throw the ROLI stuff into the mix with the C-board and the blocks, and you're taking it to a whole other level that makes it much more personalizable and unique, I think.
Well, that's the... Oh, no, you please.
Oh, so I hope this is on topic, but, you know, for me, I really got excited about music starting with digital technology, samplers, eventually computers. And, you know, I went and I learned digital signal processing, and I studied it, and all this stuff. And so the computer to me is incredibly exciting, and it can do anything. That is also sort of the problem, is that it can do anything, so you have an infinite number of parameters. You need to decide upon what those parameters are that you want to control. Then you need to figure out an interesting way to control them. And expressivity and fixed controllers are two things that computers have, in general, lacked in terms of interacting with them. So for me, what was so exciting about the Rise and the C-board is that it is a controller. It's a polyphonic controller, and that is huge. That means that I can map those things to anything I want. It could be grain size or reverb or distortion or loudness or pitch or whatever, and then I can do that polyphonically for all of my fingers and have a much more expressive sound than I could have any other way. I could have drawn all that stuff in, but it wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't have played it in the same way because it's not a fixed piece of hardware that I'm touching. It's not something physical. So for me, it's really, I mean, it's opened up expressivity with you know, digital sounds in a way that is you can get much more close to the way a stringed instrument would play, but you don't have to. You know, it's open. It can be, you can use it in a way that somebody would have no idea that you used it. It's just an input device.
Well, you know, I'll just because I'm just thinking back when Steve Octave came over and demoed the ROLI for me. The thing that I think I knew I was buying at that second was when he hit two notes and he like morphed them and then glissed them in opposite directions. And I was like, whoa, what just happened? That alone was so unusual. I don't know any other input device that can do that. And then just playing string pads, but then setting the really high sensitivity to this finger so that they were detuning as I played the string chord changes. that added just a whole other amazing, nuanced element to the process too.
It's really amazing. Sorry, Marius.
And then the simple fact of polyphonic aftertouch, which is kind of CS80 cool.
It's amazing hearing you guys talk about this because, I've never had the opportunity to have a conversation like this with a group of people working with film and composition. Some of these things were things I had kind of hoped when I was creating the Seaboard would come into being. And one of the ways I thought about it was that music is about storytelling. And film certainly is a place where music is very much used as a form of storytelling. Stories are, what makes them interesting is they have plot. They're not repeatable. Something changes, something happens. It's like a slice of time, and film is a slice of time. It's a take, and there's like a good take. And similarly, like with the Seaboard, you can have a particular take that would be very hard to recreate or repeat. And that sort of, it's like what you were saying, that there's infinite possibilities. So how do we constrain the possibilities? And human gestures have a natural kind of expression to them. And so using natural human gestures as a way of constraining the infinite possibilities into a particular moment that feels unique and real and has a sense of story to it was kind of my hope. So it's really interesting hearing the way you guys are talking about that, and such pleasure and an honor to have you all here today. So if you guys could join me in giving a big hand to the panel.